honored to be at Tufts University, let me tell you. I don't have, well, I do have a connection here. I did not go here, but I don't want to take all the time because I know everybody wants to know about how we clean up the river and so on. But I'll start with saying that my daughter graduated here in 2006, I believe. She did a number of environmental science stuff. She is currently the sustainability coordinator for the city of Issaquah, which is right near Seattle. She lives out in Seattle. Also, I have a grandson out there now, so it's all a good thing. Some of the other connections are that my father-in-law worked here for 40 years. He was the director of admissions for a number of years, and then he was the director of financial aid, and he retired someplace in the early 90s. And he actually has a memorial stone here near the chapel, which I will go see. It's probably covered with bushes and that kind of stuff. I will check it out. And it says that, yeah, the thing on the plaque says, "Nobody loved his college more." And an example of that is I have my wife and my brother-in-law. He had 2 kids. He wanted them so badly to go to Tufts, and they rejected Tufts. And they went to Brown and Harvard, and my father-in-law always said, "Those are second-rate schools. You had your chance to go to Tufts, and hopefully you'll still be able to do something with your life." And they've both done fine. My wife also went to Yale, which for a graduate degree, and my father-in-law was okay with that. He did come to the graduation and so on. My wife, when was born, my in-laws lived on Professor's Row in one of the houses there, and then they moved, I think when she was about a year old, to where that parking garage is on Boston Avenue. You see the stairs going off to the right, and there used to be another set of stairs there, and that was her house. And when I first met her, there were pictures of her standing there with the house, but the house is long gone. So things have changed a little bit. So my last connection before I get out of, move on from how wonderful it is to be at Tufts today, is that some of the key players when EPA first arrived to deal with the Housatonic, the state of Massachusetts had been dealing with GE over a number of years under their authority. They really did not have the authority to really push GE as much as they wanted to do. And that's why they essentially asked EPA to get involved, because the Superfund law has a lot more oomph than some of the state as far as enforcement. So one of our first people on the scene, his name was Dean Tagliaferro, and he is still there. He's our lead person on this. He was a Tufts graduate, I don't know when. His boss was also a Tufts graduate, and then the person who had the community involvement job, which had been my job out there for quite a while, Angela Bonarigo, was also a Tufts graduate. So we had our killer Tufts team going out there to deal with this in the beginning, and they've done an outstanding job over the time. So let me get this little changer. So I must say that I've given a number of talks over the years. I really don't like PowerPoints, but Dr. Gomez said, "Well, most people use PowerPoints." It's like, okay, I guess I can do that, So I have one. It might be a little bit long, but I'll try to get through it on time. So okay, that's me, and that's where we are today. And when I heard it was a lunch and learn, it was like, that is so good, because I've talked to groups, like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they've been at the conference all day, and they're like just sitting there, like, is this the last thing of the day? When are we going to get out of here? But people who are eating, have a lunch, munching away, a very receptive crowd. So that's why I said, yes, I'll do that in a second. So I'm going to try to cover a couple of things: why we're cleaning up the Housatonic, the consent decree, which was the legal agreement that once we got involved, once EPA got involved, we essentially said to GE, we're going to list this on the Superfund site, and they said, we really don't want that. We'll kind of do what you want us to do. And there were a number of political groups in Pittsfield, we said we don't want the Superfund stigma. We do want we want the river cleaned up. So we kind of came up with this hybrid. It's probably the only site in the country that's, it's a Superfund site, but it's not, the cleanup is going to happen under the Superfund regulations, which to GE's advantage, essentially you don't have to go through a lot of the local permitting stuff. But they wanted to keep the RCRA process, which gives them the ability during the process to kind of appeal and have conferences, so it gives them a lot more rights than the Superfund process was. So kind of the first part of this process, we're using the RCRA laws, and then we switch over to Superfund once we have a final decision. I'm just going to talk about what else we've done out in Pittsfield. It's been a huge project. I do not know how much we've spent, since GE is the one, they're the responsible party. They're the ones who pay for all the cleanup, and they, in fact, pay EPA people for our time to oversee them. And I've seen, you know, they've had some press articles and so on which said they've spent, you know, someplace between, you know, $600 million and $1 billion already out in Pittsfield. I think it's probably closer to the $600 million, but I don't know because they don't tell us. You know, people have gotten that from looking at the only place it's reported is in their, you know, kind of their annual, you know, fiscal report to their stockholders. There were a bunch of studies that had to be completed along the way. Then we finally came up with our proposed cleanup plan, and then the community involvement throughout, which I'm going to talk about kind of throughout, because my role in this has been as a community involvement coordinator. So at EPA, I am the person, and now I'm the boss of all the people who do that, but I still have kept this site for myself because I like it so much. And but it's essentially to deal with the community activists and the local officials, the congressional officials, the press, just making sure that we get our message out and that we really make an effort to get people involved and have them have a voice in how the cleanup's going to happen. And then what's next? That's a good question. You know, maybe some of you have an answer for that when we get there. All right, so the consent decree process. You know, GE was in business out there for quite a while. Going before that, it was a I forget the name of the facility. Some other company we all know that they purchased. They utilized the area. Anyway, over the years, they released contamination. Besides PCBs, which is the number one thing that we focus on, they released lots of other things to the groundwater, the river, and well, the air at points. We're not really focused on that. So after we went out, the state asked us to get involved. We came up with this legal agreement, a consent decree that was approved by the court in 2000, and we looked at the GE facility and all the property there, and we pretty much knew what had to be done. It was more standard, big industrial facility. You know, there's probably contamination in various places. We're going to have to, pick up a lot of soil. We're going to have to try to clean up the groundwater. And there were 20 different areas there. So it was a 250 acre facility, a pretty impressive piece of property out in Pittsfield there. And then in addition, the consent decree said for the upper half mile and the reach, it was like, what is a reach? When I first got here, what is a reach? But, it's just the river is divided into different sections for whatever reason. So this half mile reach was a reach that ran, the part of the river that ran right along the GE facility, which was the most heavily contaminated area. Then the 1.5 mile reach was the next section that pretty much ran through the city of Pittsfield. Not quite as contaminated, but also very contaminated. But then the consent decree for the rest of the river, because the investigation hadn't happened, there was some samples that we knew the contamination from the facility went down, extended all the way down 125 miles to Long Island Sound. Further as you got further from the facility, obviously, the concentrations went down. The river itself, I think, is 150 miles. It starts in Hinsdale, which is east of Pittsfield. It kind of winds up a little bit and then comes down. You are sharing your screen. Okay, I'm sharing my screen with all of you, I think. So, so first of all, we call the this 125 miles, or actually it's probably the 115 miles. The first couple of miles have been cleaned up, and it's like the rest of it is called the rest of river. And when I first got there, it's like, where did you come up with that term? Why is the river called the rest of river? And nobody had an answer, but I assume it's like because people said, well, we cleaned up the 2 miles. When are we going to clean up the rest of the river? And we're trying to do that right now. So anyway, so as far as, I think I already talked about this. So yeah, this consent decree, so it's not only EPA, it's the state of Massachusetts, the state of Connecticut, the city of Pittsfield. And they were the major players in it. So as far as the cleanup, substantially completed, 19 of the 20 contaminated areas. We still have one area that is the floodplain, and this is another one, like where did you get this name? The floodplain residential properties downstream of the confluence. That is the name of this section of the cleanup. And there are, where we cleaned up the first 2 miles, during that we also cleaned up the floodplain, which involved a lot of people's backyards, residential properties. We cleaned up dozens of residential properties. But these other ones were in the rest of the river area, and it's like, okay, we can probably clean those up when we get to cleaning up the river. But now we're, how many years? 17 years later, and we still haven't cleaned up these residential properties. They are areas, we did go out and sample the residential properties. They're kind of really unused areas of the properties that, they're that they could potentially be used, but they're banks, they could, somebody could put, playground equipment in there or utilize the space. But we kept saying, well, let's wait until we get to the rest of the river. And then finally we said to GE, you know what, it doesn't seem like we're getting to the rest of the river cleanup, so it's probably time to address these residential properties. So there's 9 of them. We went out to them. We explained the situation. 7 of them said, yeah, go ahead, clean it up now. The other 2 said, I'm patient. I can wait, the next couple of years until you're coming by cleaning the river and you can get my property then. This, unfortunately, didn't come out very well. But all these little things that you can't read are kind of descriptions of the 20 areas that were cleaned up. And you can see that, this is the GE facility. It essentially runs from here all the way up to there. There were over 100 buildings, approximately 114 buildings or so. So we've gotten a lot of cubic yards. Now, how much is that? And I kind of forget which kind of trucks they use there. Some of the trucks hold 6 cubic yards, some of them maybe 10 cubic yards. That is a lot of trucks that have been utilized over the time. And usually, any truck that's going out with contaminated soil, there's another one coming back in with, kind of clean soil to fill it up. So 50 acres have been cleaned up and now transferred to the Pittsfield Economic Authority, which is, kind of their redevelopment authority. They have tried to, get other companies to move into Pittsfield, and they've had some success, but much less than they have expected. So this is just an example of, I have a couple of pictures now of what the GE plant looked like. So this is actually after it did stop working. This actually is the site now that Walmart is proposing to build a large store there. And of course, that has all its local, oh, we don't want Walmart, it's going to knock out the local businesses. And it's like, well, we've been waiting for 20 years to get some company in here. So EPA does not get involved in what the redevelopment is going to be. Our role is to just make sure that whatever is going to be there, that the use is appropriate, So the assumption was it was going to be commercial or industrial, probably not industrial. We thought commercial. So it has to be cleaned up to a different, certain standard. If it was going to be housing or schools or something, it would have to be cleaned up to a much more stringent standard. We, as far as the GE facility is concerned, we don't have any any of those properties that are expected to be, homes or schools. This is an interesting picture. It's just one of their many buildings that's no longer there. But when I was out in Pittsfield, I think it was in September, I may have the date on the next picture, I was thinking, like, what is it? Because a dean who was the project manager from Tufts said, Jim, why don't you go out and take, when you're driving by, take some pictures of what it was and what it looks like now. And it took me a while, because you can't really tell what it looks like anymore. But you see that fire hydrant and that parking sign and the pole. So here it is. And it was like, holy cow. They're all the same. Actually, they really haven't improved the electrical grid out there, but you can see that is now Mountain One, which I'm not sure if they're a bank or, kind of a utility company. But all of the area where the buildings are have pretty much all been cleared. This tree actually is you can see the edge of it in the former picture. So, when they did the work, they tried to leave whatever they could. But anyway, it's just, if I can find the other places at GE, someday I am going to do a PowerPoint, one of my new favorite things, and have the before and after pictures. But I need a little time to do that. This is just another one of their massive buildings. So this was taken when they were still active. There's a train. They had, rail going through a couple of their gigantic buildings. So this picture, I have this in here because General Dynamics, so GE used to do a fair amount of defense contracting. They actually sold this part of the business to General Dynamics, who's been operating out there. This is a huge building. I thought I had another picture from a different perspective, but I don't. But they probably employ still well over 1,000 people. I don't know what the number is, but it's still a big employer. It's not a GE facility anymore. GE had their own power plant, which they had a number of years sold to, I don't know, well, it says right there, PP and GE Generating. So that's a power plant that I believe it's oil fired. It's not used very often. If there's, kind of a strain on the grid, they bring that on. And it doesn't power the GE facility anymore. It just goes, into the regular grid. So now we're going to move to the first 2 miles of the cleanup that we did. For the half-mile reach was the area I described that goes right by the facility. 18,000 cubic yards of material was removed, and this was very heavily contaminated stuff. So that's from the river. When you throw in add in the banks and the sediment, you get a bit more. And what we've done, what happens now is after we do that, GE is really responsible for doing kind of ongoing monitoring just to make sure that the cleanup stays effective, that it continues to protect human health and the environment. And so they go out there and sample. I forget what the sample frequency is now. It used to be more when this was first completed, which was, well, my years are, 2005 or thereabouts. But really, the 99% reduction in the sediment and the microinvertebrate, which are captured and sampled and so on over the years. So it's really it's been a successful cleanup during the length of the first 2 miles. So I just have some pictures here. Just kind of, I'm not an engineer, but I really get into like going out there and trying to take people out and seeing all the work that's being done, because everyone's kind of freaked out. We have this contaminated river near us. What are we going to do? And other people saying what's so beautiful, we don't know it's contaminated. But anyway, just the engineering of this. So this is a channel, the river, and the way it was done is, we built a, essentially a steel wall to divide the river in half, so the excavation could be done in the dry, as opposed to trying to dredge it when there's water. Then you're disturbing all the sediments and you're sending more PCBs downstream. So this picture is interesting because we're going to have a couple of the same spot. That house up there and that bridge will be in it. So this was, what, 2000. You can see the river, the running river, on the right side of the steel wall. It's on the wall is on this side not only to hold back the bank, but in some of these areas to prevent any other kind of leaching of PCB oil that was a problem during in this half-mile area. And it's really interesting to, you know, there's a big excavator. There's a little one they lower down to the river. It picks up the stuff. It turns, sometimes they put it right in the, what do you call it, not the shovel, whatever it is, of the big excavator that puts it into the truck over there. It's amazing just to watch these, with these construction people. That's not my job, but it is. I spend a lot of time doing that. I put this one in here just to give you an idea. So this is some of the contaminated soil, and it's obviously pretty clear. You know, that's kind of some fill, you know, some clean fill that was brought in. But, you know, pretty much during this half mile, this stuff was pretty yucky looking. This is another shot of, so we still have that house up there, of this side now being ready to essentially let the water back in. I believe this side is about to be worked on. I wasn't out there in 2000 as much. I went out there occasionally. And this is like right before they're going to essentially let the water in. So they, you know, they put new clean soil in, they put in a membrane, they then put in this riprap, which is what you call these rocks, just to hold everything in place. And a lot of people were very upset with saying, this looks like a drainage ditch. You know, you cut down all of the trees, and you know, you've destroyed the environment. There's no animals that can live here. There's no plants and everything. But restoration is a big part of what we're going to be doing in the rest of the river. And we actually did it here. And at this point, and then for the next couple of years, people were screaming at us all the time. That's one of my favorite parts of the job, to go out there and say, well, be patient, you know. Anyway, so this is a picture just a couple of years, well, actually probably later in the year. So now we saw that riprap. Now you can see all the plantings. So there's trees, you know, there's various kind of shrubbery and everything that's been planted along there. And then I have a couple of shots of more recently. All right, so this one is 2008, so it's 8 years later. So it's a little bit different vantage point. The house is a little bit further there to the right. It's off the picture. But you can see how a lot of the restoration plantings have grown, and now this is the same spot. So, you know, going back and looking at that, and then looking at this, where, you know, you can't really even see the bridge. You know, people have kind of calmed down, saying, I guess maybe you can restore stuff, but there's still a lot of people who are very critical. And it wasn't easy. GE had to plant hundreds and hundreds of various plantings, and it was very prescribed, you know, how close they had to be, what the plantings had to be, how long they had to last. They had to do very regular inspections. There was a huge beaver problem. They had a cage in all the plantings, but eventually, with them working and, you know, just moving away from the politics, GE's engineers and contractors are the best. You know, when they finally decide they're going to do something, they do it really well. So now I'm moving on to so we finished the half mile. This is the next mile and a half. And besides cleaning the channel, there were, as I had mentioned, there were a lot of homes along here. So this is a picture of a park that's, you know, there's a bunch of homes along there. But so the Housatonic River is a very flashy river, and it floods very quickly, and its floodplain is fairly wide, and it impacts a lot of residential property. So this, you know, it happens fairly frequently. So when we sampled, we found fairly high concentrations of PCBs in people's backyards. So as part of the mile and a half, in addition to cleaning and, you know, dredging the channel, we then moved up into their yards depending on what the concentrations of the PCBs were. So these are just pictures of different people's yards, and it's like, well, we hope they're clean now. No, we do know that they're clean, you know. And again, our staff as well as EPA staff. It's not an easy thing. You know, every one of those homeowners, we had to go in and meet with them individually and say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to have to cut down a bunch of your trees, you know, and your bushes and the ones you've been, you know, have for 25 years and you love, but, you know, they really need to go. But we will best accommodate replacing what we can. You know, we can't go over the top and kind of give you improvements. If you want a different kind of tree, you know, we can suggest what kind of tree might be, might do well. But, you know, and GE was right there. You know, we met with all of these people on an individual basis with the GE folks, and it's very intense. That's a big part of the cleanup. It's a big part of having a successful cleanup is to get access to all of these properties. They're all private property owners. They had to provide legal access to us. So it's not an easy process. So now one of the big questions, well then it wasn't, it was where is all this stuff gonna go? And that is a problem right now, or an issue right now during this next part. But for this first 2 miles, kind of the deal and the consent decree was GE is gonna do all this work, and they are gonna be able to, they'll need to send some of the most contaminated stuff off site, but they can also, there were two places on the GE property. One is called Hill 78. I thought I had one of the, oh, here we go. One is Hill 78, which was, it was a GE landfill when their facility was operating. But of course, it's complicated. By the Allendale School, a nice elementary school that, I don't know if it was in the 50s or the early 60s, that GE, the city was looking for a place to build a school, and GE said, we'll give you some property, you know, right? And the city said, that's great, it's free, we'll build a school there. You know, GE had filled all of that land. It was kind of a wetlands area with contaminated soil, and but the city built the school looking right at the landfill that existed, and it's kind of it's been a little bit of a thorn for us in that you know, now no one ever wants to have, you know, a landfill next to a school again. And, you know, it's not a great idea, but you know, part of getting GE to agree with the deal was like, okay, you can expand your existing landfill, and then this building 71 consolidation area. Isn't that a nice thing to call it? We call them the OPCAs, the on-plant consolidation areas. So this one was a brand new kind of toxic waste kind of landfill that was constructed there. And as you can see, it was right next to this power plant. Because when people show pictures of the landfill, it just looks like a, you know, grassy hill, but then the power plant's right in back of it, and the schoolyard is on the other side of it. You can't see here because it's all fenced off. But this, you know, this whole area, so it's lined. There's, you know, leachate collection. I don't want to say it's like state of the art, but essentially, you know, if you go to a licensed landfill someplace, that's kind of what it's going to look like when it's being constructed. But you'll see this one does. I'm pressing. I have too many buttons to press here. Okay, so this is after it was finally filled in, and now we're looking. You know, from far away, you can kind of see the power plant in the distance, but, you know, the landfill goes pretty far down. Another view here, now this is looking the other way, but over here, you can see kind of the edge of the schoolyard. But the school goes right along here with its, you know, its ball fields and whatever else. But, you know, while this landfill was being filled with contamination and building debris from all the buildings that were being knocked down, you know, we had an extremely conservative kind of air monitoring network around there. We met with the school on a monthly basis to say, this is what we're doing, this is what you're going to see, here's the air sampling results. And this was completed, I'm not quite sure, it was maybe closed up in 2010 or so. But to this day, we still insist that GE does extensive monitoring there, and we meet with the school because it changes. You know, we have people, we give them the results, and they're kind of calm, but then their kids are gone, and then there's a whole new group of families in there, and it's like, what? We're going to die because we're near this landfill. But again, so it's another part of the community outreach to make sure that we address people's concerns, and we're very transparent, and we let them know what we're finding out there. Oh, I still have a little bit of time. I have a lot of slides, so I maybe should pick up the pace here. So the groundwater, this groundwater is not being, it's not public water supply at all. So there's 5 different areas around the plant that we've identified fairly heavily contaminated water. There's some long-term monitoring going on at some of them. There is a collection system of, when you see it, it looks just like black oil. It's just PCB oil, and a lot of that is still being collected. As far as this water being drinkable again, it's certainly not in our lifetimes or great-grandchildren. So this is a slide. I kind of like this slide. This was something that we used for years, saying this is how the process is going to work. So, once we got to the point where we're finished with, or, we're doing the work on all of these other 20 sites, and we have that under control, and now we're moving to the rest of the river. But part of the rest of the river, there's a big data gathering kind of phase to it. And this RFI, the RCRA facility report, it was a large-scale sampling of like sediment, floodplain soil, biota, and it essentially provided the information that we could then do an ecological risk assessment, the ERA, and the human health risk assessment. And also this modeling study, which was kind of a fate and transport. Like if you get these PCBs in here, how far are they going to be? If you have so much in the water, probably how much are the fish going to consume, how much is going to be in the fish tissue. Kind of our objectives here are to prevent human exposure, and that's either by being exposed to the sediment or the soils in the floodplain, or consuming fish. And consuming fish was really almost our main kind of metric. So and these were fairly intensive and long processes. So this first, and we split this up in the consent decree. GE is doing the yellow, EPA is doing, or the ones that are around in blue. So they would do one report, we would do the other, and then we had these peer review processes where, outside scientists were brought in. They were reviewed, the public got a chance to talk about them. So the RCRA facility report essentially took 5 years to do. The risk assessment was really a 2-year process, submitted to the independent review by a panel of scientists. And we revised it after we got their feedback. The human health risk assessment was going on concurrently, but that took even another year. That took 3 years to get that done. This modeling study, which is really, it's kind of a numerical fate and transport kind of model, and it's really not in my lane here. So if there's any modeling people here, there's a lot on our website if you're interested. There's cleanup goals, the intermediate protection goals, which are, kind of based on those reports. They're not really the final goals until we get to cleanup objectives until we get later on in the process. But essentially, those were the levels, the numbers, like, okay, when you're cleaning up the soil, it needs to be to this level, depending on the use. When you're cleaning up for, a vernal pool, you have to get the PCBs down to this level. So those are kind of what the cleanup goals were. So all of this then went into this corrective measures study report that was produced by GE, and it was their responsibility to put this all together and propose what they thought was the best cleanup. And there are, all right, so this was all part of this corrective of the facilities. Thank you. I have fat thumbs. All right, so the corrective measure studies I was saying, so GE recommends the remedy that they feel best suited to meet all the criteria. And let me just skip it. Where did I put the criteria? I may have skipped them when I had it blacked out. Anyway, they are, the criteria are, is it protective of human health and the environment? Is it implementable? Do we have the technology to do it? And we'll find that slide eventually. But this is just a more modern slide of that first one, because people got tired of looking at that first one that I showed you. So it kind of has the same thing. And I pulled this one from an old presentation where we were getting to the cleanup plan. So there's just so many steps, and that's why it's been 20 years plus, and it's going to be a lot more years. But anyway, we eventually skipped down and got to our proposed remedy. And what it, and this was after, and I probably have some slides on that just about the public comment period, meeting with the states, meeting with GE, just all trying to get on the same page, which takes a lot of time also. But essentially, we were going to, the proposal says GE needs to excavate 45 acres of the floodplain over that 10-mile, it's a 10-mile stretch where 90% of the PCBs exist in the river channel and in the floodplain. So it's almost a million cubic yards of material, and it would result in 89% reduction of downstream transport of the PCBs. Right now, about 50% of what's in that 10 miles is still getting over. There's a couple of impoundments, a couple of dams. So that's one of the metrics we have, to measure that. That's one of the things that GE is not happy about. They don't like metrics. They don't like our metrics. Part of it is the offsite. We are saying that GE needs to dispose of all of the contamination offsite, meaning in an existing licensed facility. They would like to build another landfill right next to the Housatonic. I'll get to that in a little while. That's one of the big stumbling points at the moment. So the estimated cost of this remedy that we described is about $613 million. It'll take 13 years to go once we get going, and this kind of lays it out. That Reach 5A is, is the first part of the 10 miles. There's a lot of contamination there that would involve essentially dredging all the channel, and then dealing with the banks. Although we would not be restoring them with riprap, we would try to restore them in a little bit more kind of environmentally or ecologically friendly way. Soft, a lot of soil, a lot of plantings. So there might be some riprap underneath, but anyway. So this is, we just kind of broke out these different segments. How we would just, and this is, in the proposed plan. It's really just to give people a general idea. Like, if you live further down the river, you might not even have to worry another 10 years. You might be moved out or have turned your house over to your children or something. But I think it's an important thing that, a lot of people are, once they hear this is happening, they think we're going to be, in their yard for 13 years, starting tomorrow. But so again, it takes a lot of just individual discussions and just outreach. And we do have we have a citizens, there we go, coordinating council that I'll talk about briefly. I do need to move along here. Anyway, this just breaks out the different reaches. This area up here, this is part of like the 10 miles. So it's from starts in Pittsfield. That Reach 5B is kind of the Lenox town line, and it moves down into this Woods Pond down at the bottom where there is the first large impoundment. It's a dam that is owned by GE, which, whoops, I have my wrong pointer. Up here, there was some dam failure there a number of years ago where a good amount of PCB sediment kind of went downstream. We went up to GE. They said they're just going to buy the dam and fix it. Now they own it and they're maintaining it. There are a couple of other dams, there was a large paper company here. This dam is in bad shape. This one is even in worse shape. This one down here, the Willow Mill Dam, there's actually a kind of a high-end paper company down there that's still using that dam, although there are PCB sediments behind it. This is a small hydro plant that is owned by one of the utility companies. So they all, as part of this cleanup, we're saying you got to do the 10 miles, but then there's areas behind all these dams that need to be excavated, and GE is not a big fan of that. The Rising Pond Dam is really the last impoundment in Massachusetts. It's a fairly large dam. Again, there was some issues with it. GE went out and bought the dam, and not only did they buy the dam, but they bought kind of all this land next to it, and that's one of the areas that people are focused. That's one of the places GE said it would make sense for us to build a landfill. All right, so this is what I was talking about before, just, you know, reducing human health, reduction of risk in the environment, and then control the sources. So we want to make sure we get enough stuff that it doesn't keep being a problem downstream. And here were the things that need to be, when we're looking at the various alternatives, you know, everything has to meet the protection of human health and the environment, control the sources, comply with ARAs, which are other laws that are applicable to the cleanup, whether they be federal laws. In some cases, they can be state laws. And then when we're balancing them, you know, long-term reliability, if this thing is actually going to work, does it meet those goals, exposure goals for both people and the environment that we're talking about? Does it do something about reducing the waste? Is it effective in the short term? Can it actually be done? And then how much is it going to cost? And now we're skipping ahead to where GE is disputing this now. They're saying, you know, the cost is really more important than some of these other things. At least that's my interpretation. My attorney said, he called and said, Jim, do you want me to go over with you what you can say and what you can't say? And it's like, no, because I should know now, 20 years later. And again, some of the metrics that we're comparing these various alternatives, because there were some that were more expensive than the one, and more extensive than the one we chose. You know, how long is it going to take? How much is it going to cost? Are we going to meet? You know, are we going to shut down enough? How much existing PCBs that are already in the system are going to go over the dam, et cetera? Yeah, so here, this last bullet, we went from a no action to a large scale one that takes out almost 3 million cubic yards. Ours is just, the one we proposed was just under 1 million. And it would take 52 years instead of 13 years, and it'd be almost $1 billion. And that doesn't include the disposal cost, which is probably another third or so of that, if it was off-site. And we looked at, you know, off-site, and this is also part of the alternatives. An off-site landfill, confined disposal facility would be a landfill that was built right along the river. An upland is a landfill that's not right next to the river. And we looked at chemical extraction, thermal desorption. Those were not that effective and extremely expensive, and then there was still a lot of leftover stuff that you had to deal with. You know, you're still going to have to put the soil someplace. This is just, these were just the documents involved in the proposed plan. So I want to probably stop before we run out of time for questions. But there, you know, these are the areas we're focused on: the river and the banks, the impoundments. This is this Woods Pond Dam. That this has, I forget what the number is. It may be of the 90% of all the PCBs in the system, probably 40% of them are in this pond. So we're proposing that GE do a big dredging project to get a lot out of there. GE is saying, well, you know, we can just get a couple feet out and then cap it. And that's one of their points of disagreement. And backwaters in the floodplains, there's just a lot of areas where there are PCBs that are not part of the active river at the moment. Did I hit that thing again? Yep. That's Woods Pond. There are a lot of sensitive areas, which these are some of the other downstream impoundments. So I just want to cover this last thing. So there are core habitat areas, meaning that the state has told us there's special species in a number of places along the river that they would prefer that we leave that in place if it's not a threat to human health. And there's a box that we have to meet. There's a box where when we do a risk assessment, like we can be really protective and be at the top of the box, or we can meet our standards to be protective and kind of be at the bottom of the box. And they've said to us, if there are valuable species there, we would prefer that you be at the bottom of the box. If it's a high level of PCBs, it's a threat to human health, yes, go ahead and take it out, even if you have to disturb the habitat. And there's a lot of discussion about, well, can you really restore it? Can you reestablish what wasn't there? And you can see the way it is. So, less mobile species, a lot of those are plants. There's high quality habitat for mobile species, and there's areas that have a lot of state listed species, and then there's vernal pools, which kind of covers the gamut of all of those. And so when you look at the map, this is a river coming down from Pittsfield. All this yellow are all kind of core areas, which are areas that we have to be very careful in. Again, if we go out there and find over 50 parts per million of PCB in sediment or something, we're going to take it out, even if it's a very sensitive area, and attempt to attempt to not destroy it. And that's one of GE's things. Don't destroy the river to save it. I think that's one of the things they have on all of their web stuff. So there's a lot of that area along. I don't think we need to go into any of the, I think this is one more important point here. So based on all of that study we did about where the highest levels of PCB were, in conjunction with that, we also did kind of a use study in all these areas. Are these areas accessible to people? Is it a canoe launch? Is it just like the backwoods and only somebody who's trudging through with their waders and so on looking for ducks is going to go to? And we kind of balanced all that out. So there are 90 of these areas, and they have different cleanup requirements in all of them. So that's another fairly complicated thing. GE is pretty much on board with most of this stuff. A couple of times they said, well, we don't really think it's your use determination is quite right. And one of the things I don't want to get to the community involvement, but one of the things, and I think it's the next steps that now the GE is going to need to do, is they went back and did all of the sampling many years ago. And one of the things they need to do before they do anything, and they've already agreed to do it because in the appeal that they made to us, they appealed how much they have to dig out of Woods Pond, where they're going to send the stuff, whether we can make them do something in 20 years if the remedy fails. But what they did not appeal is that they actually do have to go do a lot of this dredging and do a lot of the cleanups in these exposure areas. And so they've already started now to begin to they have to resample this whole area, because a lot of these samples are 10, 15, 20 years old that we built our models on and everything else. So all of that has to be redone and recalibrated, and that's going to take a couple of years. So they've already started on that. And that's what I keep saying to people is like, they're like, when is the decision going to be made? And I said, well, it's going to be made, we don't know when this Environmental Appeals Board will make the decision. But meanwhile, pay attention, because GE is now submitting their plans for where they're going to do the sampling, how much they're going to do, how deep they're going to go, all this technical stuff that a lot of these people who have been involved for a long time are paying attention to. And it's very important. It's really going to set the table for the work that's going to be done later. And the last thing, the community involvement. We've had the Citizens Coordinating Council. There have been people on that for 20 years who are, just great citizen activists. There's environmental advocacy groups. the municipalities, their representatives participate with us. We used to have these meetings every month. Now we're down to quarterly, but I think they could pick up again once the activity starts going. So I think I'm probably going to, oh, there we go. I'll wrap it up there. So I'm sorry I went so long.
First, thank you very much. That was really cool to learn. You mentioned that there's been post-mediation sampling in the sediment and macroinvertebrates. Has there also been any long-term monitoring of PCBs in like the fatty tissue of fish and other vertebrates in the Housatonic?
Yes, there. I don't know the exact frequency, but GE does do fish sampling and vertebrate sampling. The fish sampling might not be annually, you know, it's every other year, if not that. You know, they do. They also do it periodically, whether it's every other year in Connecticut. So they do it, you know, for certain species of fish at certain places. So they do provide that for us every year or other year, whatever it is, and that's part of our requirement for them into the future, you know, and that's one of the things they're saying, well, you know, how long do we have to do this? And we've said, well, kind of like in perpetuity until you know, we're satisfied that there's an adequate cleanup and it's permanent.
A question about where the contaminated sediments go.
That I never got to that. So, so what we've said is that it needs to go out of state. GE said it's perfectly. Why can't we build another landfill? We built the landfill in Pittsfield next to the school, but it's perfectly protective. We have 3 other places, 2 of them that they already own, that are right next to the river, but they're high enough. We can build something there. It will save us $250 million. It'll there'll be less impact on the community, on the roads, on the trucks, and so on. And I don't want to get into that whole thing, but so I don't know what's going to happen on that. That's one of the major things that they are now appealing and disputing.
It still has to go somewhere.
It does have to go someplace, and there's some people in the community who do talk about that. Most people say, I don't want it in my backyard. You know, and most, you know, there's not that many hazardous waste facilities around the country now. There's probably, you know, less than a dozen that are equipped to take this amount of this contaminated soil. You know, GE right now is sending their stuff to Michigan from the Hudson. They sent most of it to Texas. They have a few other places. They can send some stuff around Niagara Falls, but there's the facilities up there are kind of running out of room too.
Last question.
So I sort of have a two-part. I wanted to follow up on this previous question, which is, so GE does the monitoring. It's sort of saying, like, let's have the fox guard the hen house. And so I'm kind of curious about the history of why doesn't GE pay for an independent person to do the monitoring as opposed to GE doing the monitoring and turning over the data. And then my second, sort of really not a question, but if there are internships available for our students, could they come talk to you afterwards?
Yes, they could. And I meant to bring the name of the person they should really talk to, but they could certainly talk to me. You know, we used to have a fair amount of interns. We have less now. I don't even know if they'll be paid this year, but you know that. But anyway, I don't know enough about it, but I hope we're going to have interns in the coming years, like this year. And what was the first part of the question? So the fox and the hen house. So you know, all of the people who do this are professional, and they have their you know, their requirements to, you know, be licensed and so on. You know, we do take, we have contractors out there monitoring their contractors when all this is being done. We also do take split samples, you know, at a pretty good interval. So, you know, we're very confident. You know, if somebody is trying to hide something, they're going to be in big trouble when they get caught, if they get caught. And, you know, various people have been caught, not on this site, over the years, kind of doctoring things, and it hasn't been good for them. So it's not that common, but we're still looking for it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you.